Welcome to our session, Museum Sovereignty in Alaska, Case Studies and Conversation. Melissa Shaganoff was meant to present with us, but she's had a health situation come up, so hopefully she'll be able to join us later on, but she might not be able to. First, we wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. Nadia, if you could give that for us.
Absolutely, Tamai. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon, and I am joining you from Sugpiat-Alutiiq territory on the shores of Ketchikan Bay. I'm in Homer, Alaska, and I do want to acknowledge my deep respect for the Alutiiq people, past, present, and future, who have sustained and cared for this land and all of the waters that surround us since time immemorial. And I invite you to join me in acknowledgement, respect, and gratitude for whatever land you find yourself on, because wherever you are also on Indigenous lands. So thank you for being here with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Nadia. And I'm putting a link in the chat box to a donation page. Angie, would you like to talk about that?
Sure. So we also want to make sure we convey our thoughts and prayers are with people in Western Alaska right now who are hit by Typhoon Merbok last weekend. The Alaska Native Heritage Center is partnering with Native Movement, Native Peoples Action Fund, and First Alaskans Institute on a donation website hosted by the Alaska Community Foundation. They'll also, so there's a site, and Dawn's shared that on the chat if you want to give directly. And then there'll be also a fundraising event at the Heritage Center on September 21st, this Wednesday from 6 to 8. It'll be a potluck event, and there's more information on Facebook and Instagram on our page at the Alaska Native Heritage Center. So come on over and help support a good cause if you have time and energy for that. Thanks.
And I'd also like to just add, I made a donation earlier today, and it is actually a 501c3, so it is a tax deductible donation, which is always helpful too. So why don't we go ahead and get started by having introductions. I know some of us know us, but some of us might not know who we are. So if you could just give a brief introduction, Nadia, then Angie.
Absolutely. So as I was mentioning, I'm based down here in Homer, Alaska, on the shores of Ketchikan Bay, and I am an advocate for the arts, a museum consultant, an art historian, and I'm also a person who believes very strongly that the arts have the power to connect us across geographical boundaries and time periods and cultures to help us think really critically and deeply about who we are and where we come from. And I am a program director at the CIRI Foundation. And at the CIRI Foundation, I get to direct our Journey to What Matters, Increased Alaska Native Art and Culture grant program. And this is a program that funds art programming all around the state of Alaska. And we also fund an Alaska Native Art Writing Initiative. That's a new program for us, which I'm really excited about. And finally, we support a program that's focused on museum sovereignty, which of course is very much connected to what we're going to be talking about here today. So thanks for having me.
Hi, my name is Angie Dema. I'm currently working as the curator of collections and exhibits at the Alaska Native Heritage Center. It's a 501c3, fantastic place that's been around since 1999. I'll talk about that a little bit later. I've worked in a lot of institutions, cultural institutions across the state, beginning in the mid 90s. Really my work with Alaska Native artists specifically, and really decolonizing my work, started when I started working at the Heritage Center back in 2003. I'm from Minnesota, St. Paul, Minnesota, and have lived in Alaska for going on 30 years. So that is me.
Thank you, Nadia and Angie. My name is Dawn Biddison. I'm the museum specialist at the Alaska Office of the Arctic Studies Center, which is part of the National Museum of Natural History, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution, also a 501c3. And we've been, over the years, a beneficiary of grant funding from the CIRI Foundation for multiple programs in different programs that Nadia has mentioned. And I started at the Arctic Studies Center in the winter of 2002. And I have benefited very much from starting right out of the gate on a project that was focused on Indigenous collections access, research, and documentation. And once that exhibition opened, on making the exhibition work available to the public and on public programs to make active use of the over 600 objects that were brought back home to Alaska on long-term loan. So I'm just going to stop there, and why don't we go ahead and get started with the slideshow. And I apologize, I should have had this up already because it has all of our contact information there. But I think all of you know how to reach us, and that our contact information is part of the documentation for the conference. So why don't we move ahead to the next slide. Here we go. And Nadia, would you like to take it from here?
Absolutely. So the title of our panel that we're talking about here today is Museum Sovereignty in Alaska. And what I wanted to do is kind of just start out by breaking down what is museum sovereignty for us. So maybe just starting with the word sovereignty so that we can all get on the same page. So at its most basic level, when we think about what is sovereignty, we might be thinking about it as how it's defined as a people's right to govern themselves. But there's many other closely related terms with sovereignty. We can sometimes talk about cultural sovereignty, which is our inherent right to use our values and our traditions and our spirituality. And there's also visual sovereignty, which can be defined as exercising our right to control our own narrative through self-representation. So sovereignty is often about empowerment, and it's about autonomy, and it's really about the right to create space for self-definition. So when we're thinking about what is museum sovereignty, I often think that the idea behind museum sovereignty is really being sovereign in our own ways of being and our own ways of thinking within museum spaces. I think about it as using our own terms, using our own language systems and our own classification systems when we think about how to collect and display materials within museums. And I also think it's about recognizing how we think about power and privilege within museum spaces. It's recognizing that Alaska Native people are experts in our own cultural histories and making sure that that comes to the forefront in all discussions where Alaska Native people's material culture is being discussed. So just to go over a few ideas about what museum sovereignty is, I think museum sovereignty is making sure that we're adding our stories and our ceremonies in museum spaces. It's about making sure that we have ceremonial use of objects within museum spaces. It's about repatriation, and it's about rematriation practices. Museum sovereignty is about bringing our families to museums, even when we might not be invited within those spaces. Museum sovereignty is also about requiring the ethical care of our cultural belongings. And it's about making sure that we have access to historical treasures that are in museum collections so that our community members can make new treasures that are inspired by those historical ones. We might also think about museum sovereignty as the power of Indigenous people to decide what materials to display and how to display it. And it's really prioritizing all of our Native communities within museum spaces. So in my mind, museum sovereignty is very much critical and really closely related to cultural sovereignty because museums often hold our cultural belongings, and these belongings are collectively an expression of our cultural sovereignty. So what I have up here on the screen here is, it says Alaska Native Museum Sovereignty. And this is kind of outlines the goals of the Alaska Native Museum Sovereignty Project that I work on with the CIRI Foundation. And Dawn, is it okay if I just keep going with my case study, maybe? I'm assuming that it is. That's what I'm going to do anyways. If you could go back to that slide, just go back one. There we go. Okay, so what I want to do today is share a bit about the Museum Sovereignty Program and this initiative that I help to oversee at the CIRI Foundation, and I want to share about some of the programs that we support. So when the CIRI Foundation initially started investing in projects that involve museums, and Alaska Native people. We didn't really have a name for what this work was doing, but our impetus was thinking about that it's very important that we support museums because so much of the cultural knowledge that we have is contained within collections. And we really need to make sure that Alaska Native people have access to collections so that we can be connected to our past histories. And that helps us to move forward, rooted in knowing who we are as we go forward into the world. So it's not really inventing a new concept, this idea of museum sovereignty, but it's more giving a name to a practice that's already happening in places around the state, but also places all around the world. And so the goals of Alaska Native Museum sovereignty, I have them outlined here, and it does include increasing access to collections. It's thinking about how to add Indigenous voices and names and stories in our museum records. It's about documenting and recording our Indigenous arts traditions, using our own ideas and our own values when we do so. And it's really about making space for Indigenous protocols within museum spaces. And most importantly, or perhaps one of the more important ideas too, is about creating this network of Alaska Native heritage workers, which is part of what we do with our museum sovereignty initiatives. So Dawn, if you could move to the next slide. So what I wanted to do is just share a little bit about some of the programs that the Museum Sovereignty Initiative has funded so far. And our first official museum sovereignty project was actually with the Smithsonian Arctic Studies Center, where we were able to support an Alaska Native curatorial fellowship program that was focused on creating online educational resources about parkas. And that was a project that Dawn Biddison actually got to lead. And you can go to the Arctic Studies Center website to learn about the outcomes of that project. And we could probably put that in the chat eventually here as well. We also supported a project with the Alaska State Museum, and the slide that you have on your left-hand side is from the State Museum. And as part of this project, the State Museum hired Sonia Kelleher-Combs as a guest curator to work with staff there in developing an exhibition focused on Alaska Native gut projects, and that's going to open next May. And then the slide on the right that you have there shows an image from a project that we supported with the University of Alaska Fairbanks Museum of the North, where they were able to hire a graduate student, that's Edward Zadur, who worked on researching watercraft within the museum. And then one of our more current museum sovereignty projects that we're supporting is a collaborative exhibition at the Pratt Museum in Homer, Alaska, which involves a team of 4 Alaska Native co-curators working on an exhibit about salmon culture. And this is going to open up in October. So I hope you all come down to Homer eventually to see it. But I see each one of these museum sovereignty initiative projects kind of chipping away at making space for Indigenous individuals to be able to gain experience in museum work around the state, but also it's an opportunity to pay Indigenous peoples for their efforts in working in museum spaces and providing an opportunity for professional development for Alaska Native emerging curators and museum workers. And I see that the changes that might happen through museum sovereignty work can be really small to start out with, but eventually we hope to see ripple effects where when you start having Alaska Native people working in museums and sharing their voice and adding their perspectives, eventually there will become more opportunities to bring Indigenous peoples into museums across the state. So we hope to continue to grow this initiative going forward. And one kind of ongoing aspect of our museum sovereignty project is we get to work with a circle of Alaska Native museum scholars and thinkers and artists to have kind of a little group network of Alaska Native museum professionals. So there's roughly 15 of us that are in this circle, and our numbers kind of change depending on seasons of the year and who's available. But we host regular Zoom-based meetings with this group where we get to discuss museum issues like repatriation and access to collections. We also get to talk about digital archives, and sometimes we get the opportunity to invite in museums to join our group discussions. So earlier in the month, this month, we had a discussion with the Sheldon Jackson Museum, for example, And in the past, we've also been able to bring in museums like the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So we hope to be able to continue this work going forward and find other museums that are interested in collaborating with us. Dawn, if you could go to the next slide, please. So one of the projects that our group is working on collectively is this resource that is called the Alaska Native Cultural Protocols Guide for Museums. And when it's complete, this resource is going to share case studies written by members of our group to explain how they work in museums and to share best practices for working with Alaska Native communities. And what I'm sharing with you here is just kind of an overview of the contents of what this guidebook is going to have. So it's going to have, first of all, a kind of overview of what the museum sovereignty work is. It's going to have a section on collaborative curation, which is going to share examples of best practices for how to work with community. We have a really great essay that Joel Isaac has written about working with elders in collections. There's a section on working with children within collections. Melissa Shaganoff is writing a really beautiful piece about how to work with communities by being a good host. There's also a section on language matters. One of the topics that our group has really discussed in depth is why language matters and how we use language within museum spaces. So there's a chapter about how to use correct place names. There's a section on how to make sure that you're using correct cultural terms as well. And then we have one chapter section that is working with artists within museums, where we've gone and interviewed artists who've had experiences of working in museums to understand from their perspectives what works when you're going into a museum as an artist to get best results from using collections, and maybe where there's room for improvement. And then we also have sections on digital archives, as well as a section on repatriation and care of culturally sensitive materials within museum collections. So this is kind of a work in progress at this time, but we're really hoping that this project will become a useful guide for museums to be able to consult in the future when they're thinking about how to work with Alaska Native communities and really what are the best practices for working with Alaska Native material belongings. And I do want to point out that I hope that this resource is going to be kind of a living resource that can grow and be added to as the community of Alaska Native museum professionals continues to grow. So we anticipate that the first version of this guidebook is going to be available by the end of this year. And that's something that you can go ahead and download from the Siri Foundation's website when it's available. And I'll also make sure to share it with Museums Alaska when it's available. So it's something that everyone can have access to. So kind of the benefit of creating this museum sovereignty advisory circle and this guidebook, I think, is that it's really creating a safe space for sharing ideas and also creating some visibility around the importance of including Indigenous peoples' ideas and voices and concerns in museum work. And having the opportunity to meet with our advisory group and to host meetings and to share our ideas in written format, it's really an opportunity to make sure that we're all being supported and that when we kind of support each other individually, it helps to raise awareness as a group and to lift us all up collectively and really broaden exposure of Alaska Native peoples' issues in museums. So I want to make sure that you all know that if there are any individuals out there who are interested in joining our advisory circle, or if there's any individuals out there who would like to share a written case study for this guidebook that we're working on, I want to encourage you to reach out to me so we can include you. We're trying to be as inclusive as possible. And if you are a museum that's interested in connecting with Alaska Native scholars, or if you need access to an advisory circle, if you're in a museum and you don't have your own advisory circle, you can just know that you could reach out to the Siri Foundation to get in touch with this culture, with our advisory circle. And we are really happy to work with you to think about any of the issues that you might have with designing exhibitions or working with Alaska Native community members, because we want to be a resource that's here to help move forward any ideas around museum sovereignty work. So I will put in the chats a few links about our museum sovereignty program, but that's kind of an overview of what the CIRI Foundation is trying to accomplish with moving forward this initiative.
Thank you, Nadia. And I'm happy to say that Melissa has been able to join us. Melissa, I hope you're feeling better. If you're up to it, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and we can go through the slides that you provided as well. You're muted, Melissa.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Dawn, and thank you, Nadia, for sharing about both of that. Sorry, I was a little bit late, but I'm here. Willie Jan and Sarote, Melissa Shagnos sa Setalan, Yudishu at Koya Kada Etlan, na itini anak kayak sinsiaran, artist at curator Hogashna, Chinan Kotan was at Otland. It's good to see everyone here today. My name is Melissa Shaganoff. It's nice to see a lot of familiar names in the room. I am Melissa Shaganoff. I'm a Caribou and Fish Eater Clan person, and I'm an artist and a curator. And yeah, I've worked in different capacities with museums and institutions, you know, both in the state and outside of the state. And I'm about to, you know, share something that I've done through the pandemic in collaboration with the Co-Center. These are just some images of things that I've done all over the world and around the places. You know, you see me shaving a hide there, working on some place names work, working on some curation, bringing cultural heritage items and ancestors, you know, to Glen Allen, Golcana, and Taslina area. See a hide being drip dried over there, a fire bag, and then some work that I did in a residency at Sweden. So just a little bit of some pictures of what I do. But the project that that I'm going to talk about today is something that I was really excited to kind of push forward. It was something that during the pandemic, there was kind of like a reach out, I think, to curators and to artists to come up with content that was accessible online and meaningful, you know, and kind of like transitioning to this sort of Zoom world. It ended up being kind of an interesting way to reach people all over the state and look at it as kind of an opportunity to really take some time on, you know, trying to develop meaningful practices of visiting and interviewing, even when we can't be with each other. So what we came up with was basically an online exhibit. So the Co-Center, let me back up a little bit. The Co-Center is a organization. It's a private collection in Santa Fe, and it is houses a lot of Alaska Native material. It's something that when I was a student at I had actually you know, interned there, and they reached out after they saw some work that I was doing and asked if there was a way that I could work with them, and particularly with this new collection of Kivatoric Moses pieces that they were going to be bringing in. So yeah, Dawn, if you want to go to the video slide, we can get a little bit of a look at sort of some of the what the website looks like. And so we had this idea of like how we were going to share Kivatoric Moses, these specific pieces, you know, with an Alaskan community online, with sort of the goals of it being specifically for Indigenous people. And what we came up with was kind of a sort of online exhibit that was really through the eyes of Indigenous people and Alaska Native people. And sort of the way we went about it was just just reaching out to people like Nadia, you see here, and like Joe Sanungatuk you'd seen before, their little illustrations that I did, and just interviewing people specifically about their experience with Kivitork Moses and his work, and as Indigenous people, what did it mean to be represented in these ways, and what does Kivitork sort of mean to contemporary Alaska Native art. If you want to go to maybe the goals, the page before. Sorry, Don, I went a little out of order. I'm a little out of sorts without my notes. But so some things that we wanted to make happen was that that this exhibit and this sort of hybrid experience of being online, that it would still be relevant to Alaska, that we were doing a project that meant something to Alaska Native people, so part of that was to use basically all the directions of what we were going to be talking about to be directed by the contributors. So I basically pitched an idea of that we were only going to talk about Kivitork from the perspective of Alaska Native people, sort of making a critique about Kivitork's work, to look at it for accuracy, for storytelling, and for the sort of details that are, the kind of beautiful things that we love about these pieces. The idea was also that it would be equitable, that it would be, I say, consented and compensated, meaning that everybody would be sort of part of, not only the content, but also be compensated for their time. Even though they were 20-minute interviews, everybody was going to be, compensated for every aspect of what it is that they shared. I say that it was a biased approach, and I say that that's actually an equitable approach. I've been accused of being biased in some of my curatorial things, but I think that rather than thinking of it as bias, is to think of it as more equitable, because there's a lot of work out there that talks about Kivitork, talks about specifically his contributions to, modern art in Alaska. And I don't think that we hear enough from Indigenous people as to why does Kivitork mean anything to you? What does Kivitork do for the work that you do, for the artwork that you create, and what kind of story does his work tell you? So in many ways, it was sort of acknowledging the kind of missing voice and critique in a survey of Kivitork's work. It was also created for an Indigenous audience. So the idea was that having this live all online, and also be reaching people who, are in Nome, are in the place where Kivitork was from, was an important part of this, that it was going to be able to reach everybody, and that everyone felt, who contributed, felt like they were being acknowledged in that, and shared about that. And in some ways that kind of guided the sort of look of it too. We wanted to honor people. And so part of the work that I did was I actually illustrated the whole website. I illustrated, all the portraits of all the contributors, and illustrated the flyer, and then also the images you see here, which are me and Bess Murphy, who is the other curator, part of the co-center. And the idea was that it was centering sort of the living work, the work of living Indigenous artists, and the work that they do. So, while it's important to talk about Kivitork's influence, it's also just important to recognize that everyone giving a critique and a contribution to this is actually creating things themselves. And how is it that we can sort of signal the work that they're doing, and really kind of put it out there in a relevant way. And lastly, of course, this Indigenous led, Indigenous work. It was pretty magical, going through some of these interviews, working with people like Erin Gingrich, who looks at Kivitork's work and sees a system of gratefulness is what came out of her interview, talking about how, you know, seeing all the subsistent sort of work and the care that Kivitork took, you know, in painting the animals and drawing sort of, you know, the hunters, that it wasn't done in a way that was observing. It was about a really intimate knowledge. And, you know, talking to Cordelia Kelly, you know, Kiuguk, you know, talking about how seeing the paintings of the dancing and in the chazki, you know, what does it mean to you know, think about language when you're looking at these pieces, and thinking about the sort of intimacy of like the viewer being so close to the dancer, you know, that it looks like you're sitting right in front of him. And Kiuguk, you know, Cordelia, you know, made the observation of like, well, maybe it's because we're the singer, you know, and talking about the orientation of, you know, of in the Kuzki, how people used to dance and sing facing each other, and how, you know, in Inupiaq language, it's, you don't aspirate, you bring the air into yourself, you know, so it's like you're breathing in someone, you know, and how that intimacy, it's, you know, that's what is reminded from her, that's what's brought up for her when she looks at those pieces, you know, and that's like a very important story that I think hasn't necessarily been told when looking at these pieces, because they're completely from, you know, Indigenous people, spending time with them and getting to have, you know, a voice into what these things say to them, you know. And then it's, of course, it's Joe Sanungatuk talking about being a 14-year-old kid and meeting Kivitork, and, you know, telling his dad, telling him after he told us a tale of like shooting 5 wolves with 1 bullet, you know, looking at him and being like, this guy's full of shit. You know, and just talking about Kivitork as a person, you know, telling these like these amazing and like crazy stories, you know, and how his work was so much about that storytelling and so much about that kind of life, you know, that it is this sort of visiting, you know, that's happening. And yeah, I think that doing this project was really eye-opening to me, you know, because I think that I never really looked at Kivitork's work in this way, because being a Dene person, being an Athabascan person, I don't see the same things, you know, I don't see the same things of the North, and, you know, of Nome, which I know that we're all, you know, thinking about right now, and, you know, with the horrible storms that are happening, you know, I just think that like these narratives are so important, you know. And there's even a piece in this collection that we were looking at that shows moose coming to, you know, it shows moose and a hunter sort of like from you know, a distance, you know, looking at this moose in Nome. And, you know, Joe told me about like, yeah, he's like, when I was young, he's like, we didn't have moose, but, you know, things are changing. The climate is changing. And I remember when moose started coming to Nome and when we started hunting them. And this sort of story is shared in Kivitork's work, you know, of this sort of transition that I think is really relevant to today, and what we all are seeing and experiencing together being in Alaska. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of information and a lot of stories that were shared just by looking at these pieces together and giving people a lot of space to share what it was important to them. Yeah, if you want to go to the next slide, Don, you can kind of see sort of the sort of feeling of the website. It's that it's sort of a scrolling one. I know that we kind of went out of order, but
And we're
if
running
you-
a little short on time, Melissa, too, just to keep that in mind.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, that's kind of just what I wanted to share. But if you click on the contributors here, you'll go to each one of their pages and it will show you kind of like what's available, you know. And so Joe Sanungatuk, we wanted to make sure that we featured his interview as well as his own artwork, you know, and then other people's interviews, like Nadia's has clips of some of Nadia's audio, and then videos as well. Sonia has a video. You know, I mean, Holly has a video and Sonia has an audio clip, but yeah, anyways, that's kind of what I wanted to share. Sorry, it's a little bit rambly, but yeah, that's the project. And thank you, Don, for putting the link in the bio or in the chat.
Yeah, the link to this website, which I have to say is a must visit. It's really amazing, the depth and the breadth of the work that went into this. It's in the chat box for you guys to find, so I don't have to type it out from the slide.
Yeah, and all the interviews are also downloadable too, if you want to download them as a PDF and read them later. I really would suggest that, because the time that each person took with a piece, they basically looked at the whole collection and then selected pieces that were relevant to them or that they had something to say about. And it is, some of them are pretty magical, to be honest. So yeah, but yeah, that's what I got for you. And yeah, thank you, Shanann.
Thank you, Melissa. And there's a great thought to make website content available as downloadable PDFs for people, because as we all know, websites can go away, and we like to have these things held closely and be in a place where we can see them and visit with them again and again and learn more from them into the future. Okay, thank you, Melissa, so much. And Angie, you're up next.
All right. Hello, everybody. Again, my name is Angie Dema. I'm curating at the Alaska Native Heritage Center. I have been living and working on Dena'ina Altnena for more than 20 years, learning alongside Alaska Native culture bearers and artists, both at the center and beyond. The Alaska Native Heritage Center is also called ANHC. And it first opened on Mother's Day in 1999 and was the brainchild of Inupiaq culture bearer Paul Tialana, which are named, the lake is named after behind the Welcome House. The center was created by a unanimous vote of people attending Alaska Federation of Natives in 1987 and became a nonprofit 2 years later. The goals were to create a center that was welcoming and like a home away from home for Alaska Native peoples, who in turn would welcome visitors from around the world. ANHC envisions a world where Alaska Native peoples and cultures are thriving, respected and valued, and has a mission to preserve and strengthen the traditions, languages, and art of Alaska Native peoples through statewide collaboration, celebration, and education. The center is led by a board of directors, program and policy committee, and then 5 cultural advisory committees that consist of at least 5 tribal members from each of the regions, including Athabascan, Yupik Chupik, Inupiaq St. Lawrence Island, Yupik, Unangach, and Sugpiaq, and then of course Eyak, Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian. We have about 35 staff members here currently, and generally there are about 90% of those staff members are Indigenous to Alaska. In the early days of the center, the cultural advisory groups reached consensus to group tribes together into 5 major regional groups. They established wayfinding symbols and provided support to create life-size village sites that were interpreted at the time of contact with Westerners. They also helped with exhibition interpretation, public art installations, and made sure that Dena'ina Athabascan peoples were acknowledged in programming, live programming, for being this their original homeland, and also on a permanent plaque inside the door back in 1999. I'm compelled by my ethics as a curator, of course, to provide care and access to the cultural belongings entrusted here to the Alaska Native Heritage Center, and to help provide interpretation and context for cultural belongings shared on exhibition here at the center. As a non-Native curator, it's important that I find that I work with cultural advisors to care for the collections, including, we've already talked a number of times about researching any cultural protocols for caring for collections, to provide the best care possible and stewardship in an Indigenous context. Also to provide access to Alaska Native artists and culture bearers, and really center them in this place that is theirs. And then to provide, to work with the cultural advisors to understand the collections better and interpret them for the public. Since I am non-Native, it's important, being that I am from outside the Indigenous cultures of Alaska, to make sure that people are checking for accuracy of what I deem interpretation for a piece. So going through committee is part of my job here, and I hope becomes part of everybody's job at some point that works with Indigenous collections. Decolonizing my work is done by understanding and fighting against the forces of colonization, by educating myself about Alaska Native histories, and understanding how structural racism continues to undermine the preservation and strengthening of Alaska Native arts and cultures. So returning then to, so I'm here to talk about two different subjects. The first was really cultural advisory committees and their use in a context like a museum, which it's been done here for 20 years. Please call if you have any questions about how to do that, or call Nadia, who also has a great cohort of people that can help you provide that to improve what you do at your organizations. The second part of my presentation is about my work at Wells Fargo Museum, which was formerly known as the National Bank of Alaska Heritage Library and Museum. And I worked there between November 2019 and February of 2022. And when I started in 2019 and at the end, I learned quickly that the bank was very risk averse, as most banks are, to the point that I was not allowed to loan objects or act as a collaborator with the collections I was supposed to be taking care of. And this was, I couldn't do that work without risking my own position. But I understood that risk and decided it was more important to continue working in partnership and in relationship with people I've been working with for decades by that point. So one of the first projects I undertook in the winter of 2019 was to work with Melissa Shaganoff on a small loan of objects that she brought to Gulkana and worked with elders over a weekend. And the information gathered from those elders helped identify the collections that were visiting that area, which had not a lot of provenance, and also helped us figure out the method people use to actually decorate a sheep horn ladle. So providing access improves the quality of the work that we can do. It improved my ability to interpret the collections, built on a strong relationship I have with an Alaska Native artist, and brightened a community project for elders who might not otherwise be able to visit a museum down here in Anchorage. By March 13th of 2020, like many people, I was sent home during COVID, was not allowed in the museum. And then in September of that year, we were notified that the bank would be closing 10 of 11 museums nationally, run by Wells Fargo. And that was due to financial losses from COVID. I think they lost $10 billion in the first quarter of the pandemic. Alaska's museum was the only one of 10 that was about the place that the museum was from, instead of being about Wells Fargo, gold mining, or gold rush history. So it was important to look at this as its own separate project, which I was happy they did. So I had a longer timeline than other organizations in that, or those other banks that closed, bank museums. And part of that was because there was so much more cultural material held by the museum in Alaska. So by October, I was able to get back into the collections and inventoried about 14,000 books, art, cultural belongings, archives, and photographs. And that again took about 6 months and included locations of objects in 40 locations around the state. And I was tasked then with, finding homes for 12,000 of those objects, which were housed in the museum itself. The rest actually stayed in branches around the state and in the headquarters building outside of the museum. Because the Wells Fargo collection was private, the bank was not legally restricted from collecting items sacred in nature. So that included cultural patrimony, shaman's tools, and ceremonial objects from Alaska Native groups from around the state and actually outside the state in Washington as well. And here you're seeing a slide of a macaw potlatch hat, one of 2 that were returned to the macaw tribe. So in that first, I'll go back. So NAGPRA, can you go back to the last slide? So NAGPRA only governs the collecting of nonprofit museums, universities, and governmental collections outside the Smithsonian. So immediately I alerted bank staff when I had finished the inventory that there were sacred cultural belongings that should be returned first before they decided to gift any collections away. And they agreed with me. I used their risk management language to get that to happen. And so they agreed that all of the cultural patrimony, shaman's tools and items, ceremonial items would be returned. And we had to return them to tribally affiliated nonprofit organizations. And my goal was to make sure that those were in the centers of where those populations lived, wherever those tribal belongings were from. That is where I tried to return those objects. The provenance of the collection was not well documented. So it became clear that things collected with the word Eskimo could be from anywhere in the state, right? So the Alaska Native Heritage Center and the Sea Alaska Heritage Institute both became places that we would send regional groups of things that didn't have provenance, but that also did have provenance if they were from that region. So, and then the Alaska Native Heritage Center was also deemed the repository to send things that didn't have, that were from communities that didn't have cultural centers. So the cultural belongings were returned to the Inupiat Heritage Center, the Alutiiq Museum, the Macaw Culture and Research Center, as well as the Alaska Native Heritage Center. Here you're seeing a slide of the material being returned, packed, ready for transport to the Alaska Native Heritage Center. And they also went to the Sea Alaska Heritage Institute. If you see the next slide, there's a ceremonial bib and a beautifully carved dagger. And next slide. And then you can see a crate being packed with cultural objects heading to Sea Alaska Heritage Institute. So once those sacred objects were on their way to cultural centers, there was a legal agreement in place between the Wells Fargo and Ed Rasmussen on behalf of the National Bank of Alaska. And it dictated that the Anchorage Museum had first right of refusal for that collection. And so once they were given the list of inventory that was left after the cultural belongings were returned, they made a selection, and the remaining objects were offered to 35 organizations across the state. Cultural belongings went to tribal nonprofit cultural institutions associated with tribes. And the Alaska Native Heritage Center received just over 1,750 cultural heritage items from around the state. And we'll be working with cultural advisory committees here for years to identify those and return them closer to home if we can figure out where they are from. In fact, a couple of them are already slated to head home.
So I just wanted to let you know that you're at 15 minutes now.
Okay, sorry. And that's
Okay.
all I was going to say. So I'm done.
If you have a few wrap-up comments you want to make, feel free to. I didn't mean to make you.
Nope, it's totally fine. I was done with what I was going to say. So we're good.
Okay. I was made the internal timekeeper, and
Yes,
we're 10 minutes
I
behind our
appreciate
internal
that,
schedule. So this is what always happens when you have great information being provided by people. I'm going to try to get through my slides a little quickly here. And we're trying to give brief presentations just so that we can have time for a conversation among the speakers, and then also time for questions and conversation with the audience. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was my work here at the Arctic Studies Center has been an experience where I've really benefited from the very beginning, working in a way that was decolonizing museum work and that was facilitating Alaska Native collections access, documentation, and education outreach. And that started with the 8 years of research that went into the Living Our Cultures exhibition, which was really a true collaboration, and that continued on in the public programs that we developed since then. And that was really part of the design from the very beginning, was to make sure that the collections was a start, that we had programs to follow up after that. And we had support from organizations around the state and advice from organizations around the state. And that let us continue to facilitate, ongoing collections access on these collaborative projects, but also to help facilitate community members that came in with their own projects that just wanted to do research here, and facilitating their opportunity to do that. And, just a couple of quick things about project management behind that, because as someone who's non-native, I really felt that my role was to enable people to have their time paid for, to do the really great work that they can do, and to do what I can in terms of the skills I can bring as a museum staff person to really help bring together the best work possible. And that included, from the very beginning, as early as possible, preferably, at the grant writing stage, to have Indigenous collaboration on a project. And then to certainly co-develop a project fully, and to make sure that you're getting funding that pays fully and well people's time for a project, preparing for a project, thinking about a project, having meetings about a project, and to bring, work to rural areas as well, and to be open to facilitating changes along the way. Every project's new, and no matter how much planning everybody puts into it, it takes on a life of its own, as I'm sure we all know. And, being open to the unexpected, and soliciting feedback along the way to really check in with people and to make sure that you're staying on a good path, and a really collaborative path is important. And another thing that we've worked on through these projects is to make sure that the work benefits people beyond the project itself. And that's through collaborative documentation and making educational resources online. And then, in a next step that can often be difficult, and I know it is for who I work for, is making that information about collections part of the permanent collections record, and also available to the public on online search engines. And that's an ongoing goal for the organization that I work on. And then, another element important to project management, of course, is, asking for feedback from participants, like I said, throughout the project to make sure things are going well and going to people's expectations, but also from funding agencies, particularly an agency like the CIRI Foundation that brings a lot of expertise from around the state. And then the participants themselves, set aside time after the end of a project to meet back and talk more about the work that you've done together with, for a chance to improve and grow, and even ask other, colleagues to provide their feedback as well. Programs are often an opportunity to invite people to visit or participate in a project, and that's a great way to get feedback from Alaska Natives outside the project you're working on itself. One thing that COVID helped facilitate for me was really to allow me to partner with other organizations and start thinking about that, especially since work had to become remote work. And if you're partnering with people outside of Alaska or even within Alaska, remote work is often the feasible way to do that. So I had begun a collaboration with the Inuit Art Foundation that was meant to be an artist exchange program, but had to switch to something else because of COVID. And we ended up working on, I'm on the wrong slide, here we go, a series of webinars. And it began with putting together a group of Inuit advisors to determine, the subjects for the talks, the speakers, the schedule, all those different kinds of elements. And we, paid those advisors and the speakers for their time. And, Zoom can be a good platform to record things on. And if you do a little bit of video editing, it actually comes out to be a nice product at the end to post online, and a little more interesting to watch than just a straight post of the recording, if that's possible. And one thing that was good is that, we were able to take our time, and that's an important thing, and develop relationships across time. And that's another important thing, is that, everybody's on a rush because of grant deadlines or schedules for turnaround for projects, but you just really have to make the time to develop the working relationship with Indigenous collaborators, and to really make participating a viable option for people who otherwise have busy lives and other responsibilities, both for work and at home, or subsistence and things like that. And another thing we were able to do for this project is to have a fellowship, an Alaska Native fellow to mentor during this project, both on the kind of work behind this project and in tandem her own work. So that was something that the CIRI Foundation was able to facilitate for us. Another project I wanted to talk about is building on that first successful partnership. I was able to partner with the Inuit Art Foundation again, and this time by finding a new funding source that they didn't normally apply for, because it's also a good thing to not compete for the limited funding that's available here in Alaska. And so, look for new funding and to work together to make a good team for that. So we were able to apply for new funding, and that was used to support an ongoing project they already had to help increase it and to include Alaska Natives in that project. More than they were already able to do within their own funding structure. So that was for the Arctic Art Summit. And so through a grant to the US Embassy in Canada, we were able to support having a group of 10 Alaska Natives attend that summit and participate in sessions there. And then also to have, again, online documentation to last beyond the project itself through posts to the Arctic Art Summit website that were written in collaboration with Alaska Native writer. And that featured the work of people both participating in the summit, and then other Alaska Native artists and cultural advocates and educators, which were some of the focus for the group, was people that did cultural advocacy and education. And then the last project I wanted to talk about was, I was happy to have an opportunity to collaborate with the Alaska Native Heritage Center. And this was another opportunity to bring a new funding source, to partner from the beginning with another organization, the Heritage Center, and to start from the beginning to co-develop a project for the grant, and that would help build capacity for the Heritage Center, and to provide, well, basically my time as a staff person in a way, and to work with their staff to do a project they wouldn't otherwise have time to do, but was the kind of work that they wanted to do. And so we were able to have this natural dyes project, and with lead artist June Pardue, And within this project, we had some limitations still during COVID, so we were able to develop something that would happen outside, yet still involve a public workshop that people could attend. And it also had an opportunity to continue mentoring June's apprentice, her granddaughter, Destiny Von Sheely, and to also do things like video document the project, which I'm doing right now as the editing, and then also, so those will be available online, and then to also produce a booklet about natural dyes that we'll also do. And this was definitely a project that was inspired by prior work and the work, as people may know of, Rita Pitka-Blumenstein. She did a natural dyes project about 30 years ago, working with grass. We picked harder materials to dye, excuse me, more challenging materials to dye. But anyway, I just want to wrap up there, and just by saying that I think that you know, we're a big state with a relatively small population, and we have a tight-knit museum community, I think, with great opportunities to share expertise and skills, and job skills, and to collaborate on a lot of shared goals to co-create projects and to really share the kind of work that we're all trying to do. And I think by coming together, we can create more opportunities to really fall through on a lot of the museum sovereignty details and initiatives and directions that Nadia spoke to and that Melissa spoke to. So I'm going to stop there, and I hope to get closer to being back on schedule. So for this next section, what we are hoping to do is to bring up just 3 areas of discussion and to cover a few points under each of them. So I'm just going to go ahead and read that first question and invite Nadia to have some comments to start with. The first thing we wanted to discuss, and these are sort of summary ideas based on our presentations, and the first one is, how can museum staff encourage and engage in Indigenous museum sovereignty?
Thanks, Dawn. I think the most important thing that museums can think about when thinking about how to involve yourself in Indigenous museum sovereignty, it's really about creating relationships with the communities that are around our state and reaching out to them and letting them know what you have in your collections, and making sure that they are aware that museums are places that are accessible and places where community members are wanted, and just making sure that there is a welcoming environment for Indigenous people when they show up. It's also really important when you're working with Indigenous museum sovereignty to make sure that you create a lot of space for listening. So don't go to a museum or don't go to a community with a preconceived idea of a project. It's more important to go to a community with a very open mind and the idea of listening to what a community wants or needs, and then building from there. I think that's probably the most important thing you could do in working with our community members, is making sure you give space for allowing community members to share what they want and need, and then allowing them the time to put their wants and desires first. So sometimes that might be meaning that you need to relinquish some of the control that you have over designing projects. Just give space for Alaska Native people to share what they want and need. I would say that's the most important thing that you could do. And then knowing too that when you reach out to Indigenous communities, sometimes there might be some nervousness about, who do you reach out to? Where's the best place to connect? And sometimes we hear from museums that they weren't able to find a connection with the community, but maybe you didn't try in the right way. So in many Alaska Native communities, I think it's important to recognize that we communicate in different ways. So it might not be most possible to reach somebody by just using email, for example. You might need to connect with an actual person or get a connection. And you can do that by reaching out to anybody from our Alaska Native Museum Sovereignty Advisory Circle. And if we don't know who to connect you to, we have big networks, and I'm sure we'll be able to find some way to help you find a connection point. So just make sure you think about that there are other ways to communicate besides email and besides even a telephone call. It's really important that museums make sure that they take the time to go and visit our communities and really see them in person. So that is something that you should make sure you build into your ideas around how to work with community. Go out to our communities, see what they're like in person, and then you might understand some of the issues a little bit differently when you actually have the experience of learning what, like how connected we are. So I would encourage you to make that effort to go out and visit. Melissa, do you have ideas to share?
Could you, Melissa, maybe speak to the next 2 points? Because I think Nadia did a great job of covering those first 2 points.
Yeah, you know, that, you know, being transparent, a key element of building trust. I think that, you know, at least in my experiences that, you know, speaking with museums and archives, you know, that there's sort of kind of like this fear too of like, of the archives or like how things were collected as being you know, a painful experience, and that's not untrue. But I think though that transparency is what breeds kind of like a way for a way for us through these things, right? That we're seeing kind of the whole story of how things came into possession, collections, and also the whole journey of the museums, because everyone, you know, has an experience, or at least not experience, but has a pre sort of conceived notion as to what museums have, you know, and what is housed there. And I've the more work that I do in community with collections, the more I realize that these things are alive, you know, that the collections are really considered living ancestors, and being transparent on how those ancestors came to be there is a way to build trust, even if it's a difficult story. I think that that's a really important aspect, you know, and then also creating training opportunities for the next generation. You know, I think that there's also been, you know, some sort of notions and ideas of like, well, what makes someone an expert, you know, to add something to an archive? What makes someone, you know, a person who, you know, is the voice of, you know, in my case, like the Otna people, and of the Dena'ina people, you know, who's the person who can like say those things about that. And I think that we need to like kind of take that away, because, you know, so much of our knowledge is held in community by many people. You know, it's not just one person. And I think that allowing some trust is really kind of a more Indigenous way of being, because, you know, we have things like elders and youth conference, because while we acknowledge like the amazing knowledge that elders hold for things, young people also hold a knowledge, and they also hold a wisdom that is important as far as like the perspective goes, you know. So I think that, you know, creating opportunities where young people can be engaged in all of this work adds a different value to it, and also, you know, kind of seeds a place for Native people in the future to see themselves in, you know. Yeah, I think that those two things are very important. The transparency, and then also sort of redefining who is the I don't know, the perceived power that will allow to change archival information or to add any information into the archives. Dawn and I were just having this conversation, you know, about archives, you know, not having our language, even if they've been visited by our people several times. Why is that? You know, it's like, why is that part of it? You know, why is the evidence of our visiting and spending time with those ancestors not part of the archival record? You know, and I think that there's sort of a shift that we all need to take, and I think that you know, that we're ready for. And I think that it's probably going to lead us to the next slide, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Yeah, do you want me to keep going, Dawn, or should we move?
How about, I'll just read the first statement here. How do we reframe the ways Indigenous heritage is curated? And I thought maybe Nadia could start, because it seems really timely with the salmon culture exhibition opening up next month at the Pratt, which is we're all going to go to.
Sounds good.
I hope so. Yeah, I hope to see you all there. Well, I do think it's the case that Indigenous heritage needs to be considered as a knowledge that is not something that one person can hold. There's not one Indigenous knowledge system. And so we need many of us to be involved in Indigenous curation. And the way to do that is to have collaborative curation. And this is a method of Indigenous curation. It is doing work collectively, because doing work collectively is kind of an Indigenous way of doing things. We are stronger when we do work together. We get a better product in the end. And it's a way that we need to be working in museums by adding in as many Indigenous people as you can. And as Don was mentioning, yes, the salmon culture project that we're working on currently with the Pratt Museum is a project that builds an Indigenous curation model, because we are working with consensus, and there are many of us involved in coming up with a plan for what the exhibit design will look like. And when you are able to share the burden of labor too, you also get to have a little bit more joy, I think, because you get to work together, and it's creating something that is stronger. So that's very much something to be aware of when you're thinking about Indigenous curation. Angie, do you want to add something here?
I think it's important here too. You can see the next bullet point, include current work, not just historic work. I think one thing that I see in a lot of exhibitions that is definitely something that needs to change is being in the past, talking about people in the past, Alaska Native people, pigeonholing them into a historical framework, and not bringing the contemporary picture into play. So I would think that's a really important part of any exhibition. And then, multi-generational perspectives are super important, not only in conceiving of projects and exhibitions, but making sure that, things stay relevant as long as they possibly can. And then I'll shoot it back over to Melissa. I know she's got great words to help finish us off on this topic.
I'm actually going to move to the next slide just because I'm keeping an eye on
Okay.
the time, and it's already 4:17, so we're running well behind schedule. And Melissa, if you could start us off on this next slide. And that is, how do we reframe the ways Indigenous heritage is cared for in collections? Melissa, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Okay. Yeah, I think that just to kind of like finish out sort of Angie's thought, it's like that these are like whole system shifts, right? We all know that these are sort of big, heavy lifts that we have to do, but at the same time, like, 10, 20 years ago, when archives needed to be digitized, I might be jumping ahead a little bit, but that maybe seemed impossible, right? It maybe seemed like it was a huge feat, but now here we are, and most things are being digitized, or they're still in the process of happening, right? That we have to kind of like think about how things are accessible to people, and also who is the expert in it. Angie said something about, collections, it's not just from a historical perspective, right? It's also current perspective, right? It's current people who are involved in these projects, that they should be given, the sort of expert sort of like status, in these things, and be trusted with that. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been told, like, we can't add that because, you're saying the word historic, right? And you're not a historian. So how can you say those things about your own self, about your own culture? And I think that's kind of a perspective of continuing to distance myself, and Nadia's self away from these things, when actually it's very close to us. And actually we understand them in a way that's different, sorry, I'm getting a little off topic, but So, working with Indigenous collaborators to update records and information, to make new categories of information, always adding that metadata. And really, when you feel that sort of moment of wanting to question, something being added, really trying to take the moment to pause and try to think from another perspective. And, if somebody has like the time and capacity, to ask them to, to maybe help you understand why that should be added, because there is always like a reason for these things. Like, people are not like offering this stuff to make it more confusing. They're offering it because it's somehow connected to them, which is going to be connected to their community. I also think that returning heritage, oh wait, no, that was more of creating opportunities for private time with collections. I think that, that this is just kind of like part of the work that we all have to do. And we've said this over and over again, and also, people are engaged with it. But I think that the door still feels closed to many people. So we just have to kind of do the work to have an overabundance of opportunities for people to visit collections, and that's just where we have to be. There needs to be so many opportunities that they aren't filled, and that's part of like our work as museum professionals, is to be creating those things and also building those relationships so they feel welcomed in that.
Nadia,
Yeah.
did you want to jump in here? I see you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I did just want to mention that when we talk to Alaska Native people who have done work in museums, hands down, the number one thing that we hear that really makes people feel happy is when they have the opportunity to go visit museum collections in person and have that quiet time in back spaces of museums, to really be with collections kind of without any agenda. So I think it's imperative that museums understand that that is very important work for Alaska Native people to engage in. And sometimes it needs to be done privately too. So just, I do want to outline or highlight that that's something to be aware of, and to make sure you can give space to community members to do that work, because it's a way of connecting with ancestral belongings, unfiltered, and it's really precious to us. So I just want to make sure that that's highlighted.
Yes.
Would you like to speak to the next 2 points, Nadia?
So talking about ethical repatriations, this is something I'm really feeling passionate about recently, also because it is the case that NAGPRA is it's something that many younger emerging museum professionals have not yet had the opportunity to engage in, and it's something I know many of us are interested in learning more about. But NAGPRA perhaps needs to be expanded upon a little bit, to think about how to address collections that don't fit under NAGPRA currently. So one thing that I'm thinking about is how do we get access to archaeological materials, for example, that were excavated and taken away from our communities, maybe in the 1930s or the 1920s, and bringing them back home. They might not fit under NAGPRA, but it's something that many of us feel very passionate about. And it's something that I would encourage museums to think about how to do repatriation beyond NAGPRA and why that matters. And it might be thinking about museums as not owners of the materials that you care for, but really as stewards of them, and thinking about the importance of allowing materials to go back home so that they can have the connections with our communities that our community members really want and need.
And I just added into the chat box a post to a Smithsonian statement on shared stewardship and ethical returns. And that's a new document that's been now available to the public. So I'd invite you to take a look at that too. Melissa, would you like to speak to the next point, the last point in the slide?
Yeah, so this is something that I was starting to kind of hint towards, is like, that we need to look at the kind of standards of our practices and really kind of think about what is the future of those things, because like I said, before 10, 20 years, digitization might have been sort of the next thing, right? And now we're just at that place. We're at that place where all these standards need to be changed. The Indigenous languages need to be added to the data of archival systems, and this, all these kind of like shifts and making it more accessible, and also a place where we can have some power within these systems, needs to change, right? So, if we're going to start adding language into archival information, into label information, that this just needs to be the standard that we start to adopt and start to figure out and work with communities to find out what is the standard, for these things to be searchable, to be accessible, and to feel like they're close to us, and it's just a shift. It's just a shift that is the next step in sort of museum and collections work. And that's just something that we have to sort of accept. I want to see every moment that an Indigenous person was able to come and visit this drum, right? I want to see every moment that it was played while in possession of the institution. It's like those things should be put in record, and they should be accessible, and they should be put in visible as much as the collected information from when they came into the museum is visible. So yes.
Thank you, Melissa. And I promise you, we had intended to have audience Q&A for 20 minutes, but as these things happen, good conversation and good discussions just take a life of their own. We have 5 minutes left, and I did want to stop the presentation now. And if anybody has a question they'd like to ask, you can go ahead and open your mic. I know that all of our contact information is available to the public, so you can feel free to contact us after this presentation. But we'll have time for, I think, a couple of questions if there are any.
Hi, this is Teal Hansen. I'm the culture coordinator for the Native Village of Eyak. First of all, this was a really great talk. I really appreciated so many of the points from each and every one of you. I did have a couple questions, but I'll just narrow it down to one. And this is for Angie. What we are doing when we're partnering up, we're going to partner up with John Johnson of Chugach, Alaska, and Chugach Mew, and we are going to look at, our goal is to repatriate all of the artifacts from the Berlin Museum, or the Chugach region artifacts. Right. This is a very good project, and obviously, even if it does go away, it'll be years down the line. They are going to be going to Berlin in October, and they're going to broach this topic with them. We do know that the people who we've been in contact with are for this, but obviously there's a whole big other thing. My question for you, our aim for this is to repatriate the artifacts back to their respective communities, wherever that may be. And when they don't have a culture center or a museum to take care of them, this is my question, is how did you decide, or did you ask the communities to list a museum or a culture center to take hold of those artifacts?
So really, thanks for the question, Teal. It's a great one. I did not have the time to ask too many people. I was actually given 6 months for the entire job at the get-go. And so I knew that that was an unrealistic standard. But anyway, so my thought was immediately, okay, how do I get them closest to the centers where Alaska Native artists can access them? That was my goal in quick succession. Like, how do I get this closest to the people that will use them and want to be in communion with them? So that became whichever cultural centers were available. I think that's actually a limiting way to look at it. And I think, with as much time as you're probably going to have, I'd try to plan your own cultural center if you could. And I know you have the Avanca, yeah. So, and there's other objects too. I know, Teal, you and I have talked about a paddle in the collection that I'm doing research on to try to figure out whether it's Eyak or not. So I think I think it's a time that we all kind of have to think about where can these things live, and how can we collaborate to make sure that the majority of this beautiful history and ancestors are here for the most people to enjoy. So I think we need to work together. I think maybe there needs to be a South Central repository. I know at first I thought the Alutiiq Museum was a place that was a repository for the state, but then realized, no, it's only for the island. So I think there's a hole here in the state, and I think it's going to take some talking between organizations for a bigger plan to come together. And it seems like, you know, what you all are doing is really fantastic in that you're getting to know these things, and you know, you can start to plan what that might look like if they did come home, and how much space would be needed and all of that. So good luck with it. And I don't want to take up too much more time, but we could definitely talk offline if I come up with any other ideas.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Teal. And that's one thing we talked about together, is that it's never too early to start planning for and asking for ethical repatriations, because it can take a long time. And there can always be an intermediary solution for storage that can be come up with, you know, if the Alaska Museums community can put their heads together. So, and I think Angie is correct in saying that it would benefit the museums community to consider meeting sometime, maybe under the Museums Alaska banner, to talk about repository, especially since ethical repatriations hopefully will become more and more for Alaska Natives.
Yeah. I also think to make sure not to give up, because if you're told no, then there's a lot of other ways that you could go about things, like long-term loan with hope for, you know, owning down the line. But
well, and also, Teal, there's the opportunity to partner with other organizations and other individuals in the state, so that you're not speaking alone. And I think both Nadia and Melissa are talking about that, you know, contact the advisory circle at the Siri Foundation, you know, get the support from a whole group of people, because then the answer could be, you know, different.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think my eyes were kind of open for how much you guys do. I think my idea was a lot more limited. So that's good. Yeah, the people who we did reach out to was just Chugach and Chugach, Alaska, just because John Johnson has experience with repatriation. But I think that is a good idea to really open up our horizons and really talk to more people, which makes it hard sometimes when you have to, you know, get ideas from so many people. But I think it's something that we are definitely wanting to communicate and work together. And at this point, we're just hoping for letters of desire from community members, museum personnel, elders, just address the Chugach saying that, you know, we support this, or that we desire these artifacts for this reason. That way they can bring these letters to Berlin and say, you know, and that way they can be representatives of the region, the Chugach region. And so
yeah, and I think if you contact folks at Museums Alaska, like Dixie and Angie and Monica, you know, they would be able to help with that sort of groundswell that you're trying to build.
That's great. Thank you.
Teal, I also just wanted to say I'm actually going over to talk to them about Otna repatriation things as well in early October, in a couple weeks actually. So I think that there is like a lot of coalition building that Alaska Native people can do, you know, to convince them, you know, to show them that we care about these things, that they need to come back, and that we need to put them either to rest or to use, you know, for our use. So
yeah,
that's awesome.
And I mean, all of these artifacts from the 1880s, they've never been on display. Just a couple of items have been on display. And so I feel like it's just almost a cost of them to have to take care of them and to hold on to them, when it could, you know, mean more to the people. And what John Johnson did say was that they are looking for a cultural connection to, you know, the people in the area. So if that's something that you guys are looking into as well, maybe that's one angle that you can come at, you know.
Yeah, and that's something we discussed when we were trying to narrow down our conversation, was talking about ethical repatriation. And museums have a thing called deaccessioning, and it's something that they can make more active use of. And especially when it comes to museums so far from Alaska, especially in Europe, where those pieces have never been put on display, Alaska Native community members have never seen them or visited with them. There are very strong grounds for ethical or moral or whatever you want to call it, repatriation. So I think there's a lot of opportunities in Alaska for this. And I think that it's something that it would be great if Museums Alaska can take, maybe there could be a working group next year prior to the next Museum Alaska or whatever, Dixie and those folks there with their brilliant minds can put together. But I think there's a lot of ways that Alaska Natives can bring back their heritage, bring back their family members, through this new initiative that's starting and that's way past due.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, there's a huge wave right now, and it really depends on how we approach things. And we can approach things like the sweet auntie way, but if that doesn't work, there's also the warrior way. It's kind of how we've been considering this, because it's great PR for them too, because otherwise they don't have any use for it there. Besides to just have those items on their resume, basically. So I think that it could be beneficial to all parties, and I'm just really hopeful. I'm also hoping that since COVID has really connected the world digitally, that the process isn't going to take as long as it normally would.
Yeah, and maybe that's something, Dixie, that Museums Alaska can begin to, not to give you even more work than you already have, can begin to put together as maybe a discussion sooner than the next conference or at the next conference that could really revolve around ethical repatriation and coalition building and having Indigenous leadership on this initiative within our state.
Yeah, it's something we discussed at the cohort, and it's something I know that the board and I will be discussing in upcoming board meetings as well. So yeah. Great.
Glad to hear it. Well, I'm glad we had time for this, really top priority discussion. We are running past time. So I wanted to, I just muted myself, sorry. I wanted to go ahead and thank everyone for joining us and taking time out during your busy day to be with us and to think and listen to us. And we're all available by email. And so feel free to contact us. And thank you to my co-presenters, Nadia, Melissa, and Angie. Thank you very much. And thank you, Dixie, for the opportunity to speak to this group.